Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 29 of Series 5. The question this evening is, how are values expressed and overlooked in human life and experience? Again, background reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 4. And my underlying question is again, what can we do with human existence as consciousness? So I present consciousness as presuppositional to human existence. Consciousness is the most fundamental way of defining who or what we are. The fundamental questions of consciousness, the fundamental questions of human existence must thereby be asked in terms of consciousness. And I previously defined consciousness in terms of cognition, affect, will and value. We could also say more broadly, consciousness is all those states that I am conscious of. And I've explained why ultimate questions of consciousness need to be resolved in terms of value. In response to the question, I proposed the principle of the will to value, or the value of value, consistent with a certain sufficiency of value. Today, I want to discuss how value finds expression in the world in general. One of the problems here is that values are so ubiquitous that it's difficult to focus on particular values. Another aspect of this problem is distinguishing value from other states like cognition, affect and will. I've recently discussed the relation between values and their cognitive objects. The problem is that values invariably involve cognitive objects, making their differentiation difficult. So I will first reiterate 4 basic ways in which value and sufficiency of value are expressed in human life, and how these expressions of value are expressed in cognitive frameworks. Firstly, ethical principles are values that guide our actions, and the sufficiency or independence of value is expressed as ethical fortitude. In religion, God is the believer's highest value, and the idea of God expresses sufficiency of value in omnipotence, omniscience, all good, etc. Romantic love is also a mode of value, and love is typically self-sufficient and independent of social endorsement. A meaningful life is also a valuable and worthwhile life, and again a robust experience of meaning is resistant to adversity and loss. To show how values are expressed in the world, I have previously explained how they have been neglected. I won't reiterate an error theory in which consciousness and value are prime candidates of obfuscation. Instead, I can briefly review the neglect of value by outlining the philosophy of logical positivism. Auguste Comte of 1798 to 1857 is the founder of positivism, that only hard scientific facts count. He saw progressive advances from theology and metaphysics to a final stage of positive facts. This view influenced the subsequent logical positivism of the Vienna Circle and A.J. Ayer. The Vienna Circle and Rudolf Carnap dismissed the significance of value. They held that value judgments are senseless because they lack cognitive content. A.J. Ayer endorsed logical positivism through his principle of verification. That is, a proposition is only meaningful if it is subject to verification as either true or false. On this view, religious, ethical, poetic, intuitive, mythological, and value judgments are disregarded as meaningless. Ayer himself and others later rejected this view as excessive, but it nevertheless influenced philosophy. Analytic philosophy continues to emphasize language, logic, precision, and verification. Non-cognitivist concerns about affect, will, value, meaning, purpose are given less attention. This emphasis on objectivity and fact paved the way for a counter-reaction in terms of subjectivity and value. This was largely taken up by existentialism as a philosophy of human experience. Much of existentialism describes human situations, but there are also detailed examinations of consciousness and value. Sartre and some other phenomenologists regard consciousness and value as coexisting. That is, the idea of value is intrinsic to consciousness and is consistent with value in every aspect of our lives. Sartre writes that consciousness cannot arise at the same time without disclosing values. This concurs with the modern view of Hilary Putnam and others that knowledge is value-laden. Value-laden knowledge implies, and Putnam argues for, the breakdown of the fact-value distinction. The view that value is intrinsic to consciousness can be explained with the concepts of choice and selection. Sartre writes again, every choice supposes elimination and selection, and thereby produce value. Choice isn't just a preference, but a selection traced back to its ontological foundation. Sartre wants to trace selection to its ontological foundation, but he doesn't do this explicitly himself. As previously explained, we can extend the notions of choice and selection with the concept of contrast. Monotone is inimical to selection, choice, value, perception, and indeed consciousness. These capacities need contrast like a black spot on a white board. Or we can say that every perception entails contrast, selection, and value. That is, we look one way and make a selection and preference that produces an antithesis or negation. Selection entails preference and value. Elimination implies contrast as a precondition of value. Yet these may be nascent values, yet that is expected at the origin of value. The point is that value is ubiquitous in every aspect of our lives. Yet we can go beyond Sartre and even Freud in finding an expression of values in the unconscious. Sartre rejected the unconscious as both an aspect of consciousness and as significant to human existence. But the idea of the unconscious can be seen in Aristotle's notion of the internalization of values. Here we not only have the Freudian idea of the unconscious influencing behaviour, but an Aristotelian idea of conscious thought internalized into the unconscious. To recap, Aristotle's virtue theory of ethics define virtue in terms of internalized disposition and character. Conversely, Kantian ethics define virtue in terms of unfettered conscious choice. There wasn't an explicit concept of the unconscious in Aristotle's era with which to present this alternative view. The point here, though, is to show an expression of values even from the unconscious. The unconscious and consciousness compete for significance in psychology and philosophy, respectively. Conscious activity is emphasized by analytic philosophy, phenomenology, and existentialism alike. But in a broader perspective of human existence, the unconscious has considerable significance. For example, in existentialism, authenticity is one of its main principles of behaviour. But authenticity can be better explained as consistency between conscious and unconscious values than a consistency between an unexistentialist self, true self, and an acknowledged self. More broadly, the internalization of unconscious thought and values has a huge effect on human experience. For example, consistency between unconscious and conscious thought and values affects activities like ethical judgment, motivation, meaning and purpose. One question is, to what extent should conscious choices be influenced by the unconscious? The idea of the unconscious expression of values also raises the question of animals having values. Animals don't have capacities of abstraction, free will, and thereby don't have moral values. But animals have desires expressed in instincts, reproduction, hunger, and the avoidance of pain. Therefore, in this sense, animals can be said to have values, but not moral values. I have wanted to show the scope of value expression in human life, with correlation between value and consciousness, and the expression of unconscious and animal values. I have also previously outlined the expression of value in religion, ethics, meaning, and romantic love. And I have explained how other people are a primary focus of value in the world, as well as how values are even inherent in truth, knowledge, and scientific theory. My objective is to show how, as Anthony Grayling says, the world is saturated with values. Hilary Putnam puts it in terms of the breakdown of the fact-value dichotomy. Put differently, in the 19th century, science was regarded as objective and value-free, but now science is seen as value-laden. Given this ubiquity of value, the question returns to the quantification and primacy of values. Nietzsche stated that the future task of philosophers is determining the order and rank among values. But this understates his revaluation of values and his desire to create new values. But the ubiquity of value also raises several other problems rather than just one problem. One is, how can we privilege certain values over others? Two, another is, how can we privilege value over other states like cognition, will and affect? Three, the variability and diversity of value suggests that several phenomena are masquerading as one. In the latter problem, the variability and diversity of the concept of value is widely recognised. Desire, wanting, love, hate, morality, aesthetics, bias, perspective and meaning are all regarded as values, but they are very diverse mental states. Yet more broadly, features and classes of value are widely recognised, even if not universally accepted. They can be classified as subjective or objective, intrinsic or instrumental, or affective or cognitive, etc. I offer one possible classification of different values. This, firstly, perspectival or incipient values of value-ladenness, bias, truth values, numerical values, or a certain absolute conception. 2. Motivational or moral values, in which we find reasons for action or ethical criteria. And thirdly, we have experiential or affective values, which include love, hate, desire, meaning, guilt, shame, pride, disgust, etc. The problem again is whether all these states can be properly described as values. Perspectival values don't seem to have subjective experiential content at all. Yet properties like subjectivity, preference and quality might provide unity for the concept of value. Yet my underlying point is that the variability and diversity of value also illustrates the scope of value. The second problem was that states of cognition, will and affect are also ubiquitous like value, so why privilege value? This begs the question of whether cognition, affect, will and value provide adequate comparative scope. We can't answer this question today, but we can outline some limitations of these states. I've discussed the scope and limitations of cognition in earlier workshops. Some of the limitations of cognition alone are highlighted in the cognitive non-cognitive debate. It can be argued that the fundamental principle of morality can be explained by cognition alone, but it's less likely that motivation could be explained by cognition alone, and meaning and purpose even more. These are, of course, exceedingly short summaries of long and complex discussions. A prime example of affect is happiness, an undisputed human good featured in ethics and utilitarianism, and also an alternative to ethical understanding in the view of Nietzsche. But happiness or affect lacks value content. It isn't intrinsically valuable and doesn't resolve meaning and purpose. Happiness is also cognitively blind. It can't answer questions or provide explanative theories. Thirdly, the will is a fundamental aspect of mind with different functions and with different relations to value. We may speak of the will to truth, the will to pleasure, the will to value, and the will to will, etc. The will is a form of motivated value. That is, I may value something, but without will, I won't pursue it. The will is more a means to an end rather than an end in itself. So, fourthly, expressions of the will imply value and thereby underline the significance of value. Wanting is a directional capacity of the will that implies value. Choice is a selective capacity of the will that also implies value. loving and hating, or positive and negative affective capacities of the will that further imply value. We have also defined value, ostensibly in previous workshops. As noted earlier, value can be defined in many complex ways, or more simply by examples such as liking, wanting, love, hate, moral and aesthetic judgments, or philosophically as intrinsic, attributed, instrumental, perspectival or incipient values, or as I do, as qualitative intentionality related to choice as the selective capacity of the will. The first of our earlier questions was, how can we privilege certain values over others? I previously given several criteria for establishing priority among values, that is, coherence, consistency, independence, sufficiency, quality and self-validation. These criteria have led me to introduce the hypothesis of the will to value as a principle of life. The will to value was also introduced by contrast to Nietzsche's will to power and the will to will. So I want to very briefly note some arguments for the will to value as a principle of life. Cognition, firstly, cognition, affect the will alone, are inadequate as guiding principles of life. 2, value and its affirmation by will provide meaning, purpose, experience and moral content. Thirdly, the will to value is consistent with and is maintained by the will to truth. Fourthly, the will to value is self-validating, like systems, like mathematics, logic, the cogito ergo sum, the denial of which is self-negating. Yet these observations aren't just an argument for value, but again they also outline the scope of value. Another aspect of the scope of value is the potential of value in the creation of new values. Some theorists like Iris Murdoch, William Frank Kenner and the religious oppose the creation of values. The notion of structure in the form of the graduation of mind or consciousness has consequences here. New circumstances and higher levels of consciousness require new values and new principles of value. New possibilities, new questions and new awareness necessitate new values in order to resolve them. We certainly create trivial values, and when we define life as an adventure or whatever, we also create values. Development of value is evident in ethics of behaviour, rules, intention, psychology and postmodernism. Rule-based ethics of behaviour had to make way for Christian ethics of intention. And a Christian ethics of intention had to make way for an ethics of psychological considerations. Increasing understanding and awareness also increase free will, which expands the scope of value. I have previously argued for degrees of free will, as do Merleau-Ponty and others like Julian Baggini. But values, as I've implied, values are expressed in so many ways that this becomes problematic. It's an embarrassment of riches. We can find them in mental states like desire, wanting, love, hate, choice, will, bias, or in fields of activity like ethics, meaning, purpose, aesthetics and politics. This problem of the variability of the concept of value can be ameliorated by quantifications such as intrinsic, attributed, instrumental, etc. And as previously noted, a possible unification can be found with properties like subjectivity, preference, and quality. We have been able to understand and delimit the scope of value by contrast to cognition, will, and affect. But none of these states are isolated. They overlap and concatenate with each other. For example, cognition isn't value-free, but contains elements of affect and will contains elements of value. Finally, the scope of value has also been expressed in the principle of the will to value value. And the scope of value has been extended to potential values with the creation of values. And we are left with the question, what values can we create in the future? One problem of this topic is trying to present the diversity and scope of value in a limited context. Another problem is finding order, unity, or priority within this diversity. Existentialism and postmodernism present different forms of the relativity of value. Isaiah Berlin presents a pluralism of conflicting values without discarding a preference for certain values. And the most central value that we might want to uphold is the value of other people. And the value of other people is the topic of discussion for the week after next. Okay, thank you very much. Let me have your criticisms and comments in the various websites.